It doesn't have a chance to really dry out in the same way. So the excess moisture can sometimes cause that problem if you've got a brick. But usually with the naturally yeasted bread, it lasts for it will eventually mold. It will eventually, but it usually is quite a few days longer than a...
Balance was way off somewhere.
Yeah. So, sorry, over here first, and then to you. Question over here?
If you toast the bread, is that
Probably, my guess is, I don't know, because it has to reach a certain temperature and be there for so many minutes. So I don't know if it really gets to that point with toast. So that's a good question. But even then, what happens when it recognizes it's in peril? It would send out spores, and when they get in your digestive system, they would hatch again. Because they're already living in there, so it's hospitable for them. Yes?
2 questions. Is this recipe on our paper?
Yes.
And then, where do you...
Oh, sorry. Let me repeat her question. She wanted to know if the bread you're tasting is the same bread on your recipe, and it is.
And so if it's not a lab-generated yeast, where do you get it?
From me.
And where is it? And you got it from...
So, okay, I'll give you my genealogy, my natural yeast genealogy. I'll explain that to you in just 1 second. So the genealogy of my starter is, I got my starter from a lady that I drove to St. George to take a class from. And she got her starter from a guy in American Fork. His name is James Simmons. He has a website that is phenomenal. It's called LDS Health Today. He does a lot of raw things, but he has some amazing recipes that are good for families, that help you incorporate raw natural foods into your diet, and they are so tasty, and he has just a million videos that show you exactly how to cook it and how to prepare it. So great website. So Nancy in St. George got it from Jim Simmons in American Fork. He got it from a Dr. McClan in Provo, who got his, as far as I understand, from the Carl Griffiths 1849 starter in San Francisco. That's as far as I've researched. And, historically speaking, starters were passed down from family to family, from mother to daughter. And I have a little thing in my book that I put in there. A thing that I had read is this Greek woman who was watching her mother prepare the bread one day, and she said, "Well, Mom, where did you get your starter?" And she said, "Oh, I got it from my mother." So where did she get her starter? Well, from her mother. She said, "Well, what do you do if you don't have a mom or a grandma to give you a starter?" And she said, "Well, then you don't bake bread." As simple as that. So, it used to be something that was a part of everyday life. If you were a young girl growing up in a family, you grew up watching your mom make bread, watching your grandmas and your aunts and everybody prepare this bread. You didn't have to come to a class to learn about it. It was a part of your life. By the time you were knee-high to a grasshopper, you could do it yourself. We've lost that. There's this gap, this knowledge gap, and more importantly, an experience gap. Where we've lost this tradition that's been handed down, and now we're having to relearn it, and we have to approach it trying to recover this much data that in other cultures is just handed down intrinsically, and we have to go out and search it out and intentionally try and make it part of our lives to make it happen. So let's move into the how, right? So this is where we're going to take you from theory to practice. And as I go through this, I'm going to be giving you 3 very important keys to success. I don't know why this thing is ringing at me now. I must have changed electromagnetic fields or something. But I'm going to be giving you 3 keys to success, so listen for those as we go through. These things are all also available on my blog. Okay, some of this information is not even in the cookbook. Things that I have discovered as I've helped thousands of people learn to bake with natural yeast. So if you want to take notes, but also know that it is on my blog. My blog, I think, is on the handout. If you didn't get a handout, it's thebreadgeek.blogspot.com. I have some really great posts on there for troubleshooting in just the last couple months. So here's what we're going to start with. We're going to start with housing, because I talk about my we were joking before, my starter's name is PETA, and my kids know that, and my kids are well trained. They keep an eye on PETA as well, and let me know if it looks like he's hungry, or PETA doesn't look like he feels very good, because that's how I talk about my starter. So that's how I'll be addressing the starter when I'm talking to you. So we're going to talk first about housing. I have my starter right now in a plastic container just for transportation purposes. I do not recommend keeping your starter in plastic or in metal. Here are the reasons for that. A starter is an acidic environment. If you have a metal container, even if it says it's stainless steel, I just don't trust anybody anymore. There's probably some loophole in some legislation that says that you can have 20% basic metals and they don't have to tell you, and they can still call it stainless steel. Because it's acidic, if there are basic metals in your container, it will leach those basic metals into your starter, which means it will end up in your bloodstream. If you know anything about Roman history, you know that's a bad thing. So we don't want basic metals in our bloodstream. We're not going to put it in a metal container. You can stir it with a metal spoon. You can prepare your dough in a metal KitchenAid bowl. That won't hurt it. But you don't want to store it long term in a metal container. Same thing goes for plastic. I'm talking the long term. Transportation is not an issue. We know what's in plastic that we don't want in our bloodstream. Even the BPA-free stuff, we don't know what else is in there that we just don't want to be consuming. So I don't recommend plastic. I recommend a glass jar. I recommend that it's see-through. People say, well, can I keep it? I have this really cool crock, and can I keep it in there? If you really want to do a crock, I would say make sure it's food safe, because there are a lot of decorative crocks out there that have a lacquer sprayed on the inside. Again, you don't want to be eating that. So I keep mine. If you have ever heard of Adam's peanut butter, they have this jar in their large peanut butter jar that it's pretty big and it goes straight up with no neck. So it's really easy for stirring. So that's what I use for my starter at home. And the other benefit is you should, to begin with, and why I don't recommend the crock, especially for beginners, you should be able to see your starter activity from the side, because that will give you a good clue as to what your starter is doing. Okay? And you need to keep an eye on it. You need to be attentive to your starter. I'm actually going to start passing this around while I'm talking, because we're going to start addressing some things that I want you to see. I want you to notice a couple things. I want you to notice that while these bubbles are maybe a little small in some places, that there are bubbles all the way through this whole thing. You can turn it, and in any corner you can see that even if it's a little obscured, you can see bubbles in there. The other thing I want you to notice, I want you to smell it. I want you to see what it smells like. And also to notice that when you look down at the top, you can see where there are bubbles right under the surface. If you look closely, you can also see in some of the crevices of the starter, there's a little bit of liquid in there. We're going to talk about that liquid, so I want you to notice it. Okay, so we're going to pass this around real quick. Okay, so glass jar. It needs to be breathable. If you have a canning jar, all that means is you take that lid with the gummy seal and flip it upside down so that you're not creating a seal when you screw the lid on. Okay? It doesn't need to be like, totally open to the air. It just needs to be able to it needs to not be airtight. These are living, breathing organisms. They need access to oxygen. Okay? So you don't want it airtight. Also, no, if you're going to cover it with a cheesecloth, I have a lot of people do that, put a cheesecloth in a rubber band. That's fine too. Just know that the extra access to air, you might get a little bit of a crust on the top of your starter. That's okay. You can just pull that right off, or you can stir it back in if you want, but it's not harmful. Just know that will happen. So that's the container. That's what I recommend. It needs to be breathable, it should be see-through, and it should be glass, ideally. Now we're going to talk about geography. Where are you going to keep this thing, right? This new pet you're taking home. This is the first key to success that I'm going to give you. I recommend that you keep your starter in the door of your fridge, and that you check it every time you open the refrigerator door. You'll understand why that's important in just a minute, but here's the reasons behind keeping it in the door. Number one, it's the warmest place in your fridge. If you put it on the shelf, you're going to have to reach behind it to grab something out, and then when you put that something back, where is it going?